Welcome to Brain Nevat. I'm truly delighted to be joined by two of our favorite guests, Eric Sampson and Rebecca Tuvel, and we're going to be talking about academic freedom. Eric, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Sure. So imagine it's fall 2021 and you're 2 weeks into a new postdoc at a small liberal arts college. And your first task is to organize a public talk that demonstrates philosophy's practical relevance. So with the help from your very well-connected department chair, you managed to land Peter Singer, who's arguably the most famous living philosopher. And he's going to give a talk to the whole campus community entitled Pandemic Ethics, which in fall 2021 is very timely. So you put the finishing touches on the event, you triumphantly announce it on the faculty staff listserv, which goes out to the campus community, over 700 people on campus. And you imagine that they're going to be absolutely thrilled with this event because you got this, big name to come to this small school. But within the hour, you find out that they're not excited at all. They hate it. And it begins when a disabled faculty member sends a reply all email to your advertisement criticizing the event on the grounds that Peter Singer is a known ableist. So this faculty member quotes Peter Singer's 1979 book, Practical Ethics, where Singer argues that euthanizing severely disabled newborns can be morally permissible if the parents consent and wish to replace it with a non-disabled baby. This is Singer's very infamous replacement argument. Many other faculty members are seeing this for the first time, and they are appalled. They join in to criticize the event. And a campus-wide pile-on ensues. There's just tons of emails in this reply all going out to even the baseball coach about how terrible this event is and how Peter Singer should be disinvited. At least that's many people's view. The next day, administrators pressure your department chair to disinvite Singer. Students and faculty and alumni flood your inbox with angry messages telling you what a mistake it was to invite him. Students organize a protest by posting flyers with Singer's face and the damning quote from Practical Ethics all over campus. A few people defend the invitation on campus, but very few do. And the overwhelming verdict from the campus community is that this is bad. You screwed up. Peter Singer's bad. You're bad for inviting him. And this was a big, big mistake. So you find this all very puzzling. On the one hand, you think, look, no one could be more qualified to give a philosophy talk on a college campus than Peter Singer. But on the other hand, you understand the concerns about this invitation being at least potentially harmful or disrespectful to disabled people. And you think those are legitimate concerns. And this gets you thinking about how to handle these conflicts between academic freedom on the one hand and concerns about harm and danger on the other. And in thinking about this, though this is a very specific case, you begin to realize that this is an instance of a more general phenomenon in academia. So just to take a few cases from philosophy, I mean, Rebecca has the famous 2017 case in Hypatia. She defended transracialism, the view that it's possible and permissible to change your race. Many people found that article harmful or dangerous to trans people or Black people and called for its retraction. Kathleen Stock has defended the view that women are adult human females, which means that trans women are not women, and she's had many of her events protested. So famously, she was scheduled to give a talk at the Oxford Union and was protested by lots of people. One student poured concrete over their hand and cemented themselves to the ground in protest. A friend of the show, Steve Kirshner, was banned from his campus at SUNY Fredonia. He defended consensual adult-child sex in a 2017 book, and that got some play on the internet. And many people thought that his presence on his college campus would be psychologically harmful to people who had suffered sexual abuse. Nathan Kofnas at Cambridge University has had tons of trouble because he defended the view that there might be racial differences in IQ across races. Holly Lawford Smith, Alex Byrne, both had difficulty publishing their book. All of these are concerns about, on the one hand, academics having the freedom to express their views, but on the other hand, those views often being regarded as harmful or dangerous to other people. And now we want to know, how should we think about these sorts of conflicts?
Well, a little spoiler alert, the way you sort of set this case up was that it was a hypothetical, but this is something that both of you endured on campus and I think dealt with aplomb. Ultimately, the sort of calls for Singer to be banned, you valiantly resisted, and the talk went ahead. But as you point out, there is this difficult balance. On the one hand, it seems like the purpose of a university is to challenge students' minds, to have them come to grips with different perspectives to the ones they grew up with or were exposed to try and evaluate which arguments are good. But also there's a sense in which universities are now seen as this safe space where parents will send their children and they expect them to be looked after and not exposed to danger. And the one argument is that exposing people to certain ideas is dangerous. So, Rebecca, what do you think about this idea that we should silence some speech to protect people from danger?
Well, it depends on the kind of danger we're talking about. Are we talking about physical danger or harm? Obviously, if a speaker is coming to campus and we have really excellent reason to think that there will be imminent physical harm to people on campus, then it makes sense to postpone the talk, see to it that people's bodily security is taken care of. Of course, we don't want to allow a situation to come about where anybody will be physically harmed. We can attend to safety now and then postpone the talk to a later date. What if it's psychological harm? So, intense emotional distress or profound offense. Um, if a speaker shares a view that causes intense emotional distress or profound offense, uh, and yet they're making arguments and giving good reasons or reasons for their view, then that is simply a feature of the university that we need to tolerate. Why is that? It's because trying to figure out and sort through the answers to difficult, high stakes moral and political questions is one of the major things that we do at the university. And for virtually any position you take in these debates, you will cause distress or offense to somebody. Of course, you're not intending to cause offense, but offense or distress is simply an inevitable feature of the fact that people have very strongly held convictions and investments in particular views, whether it's abortion, immigration, um, views about the criminal justice system, gender transitions for kids, any major debate in moral and political theory will raise uh, discomfort, psychological harm for some uh, people. So I think we need to regard that psychological harm as an unfortunate but necessary feature of doing the work that we do at the university, which results from trying to answer difficult questions on which people disagree.
So, Eric, I wonder if you can elaborate on this idea of university as an institution that's somehow different. So, you might think, for example, if you're sitting around a dinner table with your grandma, that there's certain things that would be like really impolite to bring up in front of grandma. Or that if you're in a nursing home and you're trying to make people feel, safe and comfortable, that you don't really want to talk about the ethics of euthanasia with them. They might find it incredibly alarming. Why should we see universities as a space that's somehow different?
So you're right that certain speech is going to be appropriate for certain settings, and we want to understand, well, what makes it the case that different utterances are appropriate in different contexts? And I think the answer is, what is the point of the expressions that are happening in the relevant context? So in a case of a funeral, what is the point of a funeral? The point of a funeral is to memorialize some person, to reflect on their life, to celebrate them. So that's what explains why it wouldn't make sense to begin selling insurance in the middle of a funeral. That's not what we're doing here. We're trying to memorialize this person, or at the dinner table to go off on, like, I don't know, some like weird racist screed or something like that. Like, we're just trying to hang out and you're trying to have a good time here. Now, what about in the academic setting? Why is it okay for someone to go talking about race and IQ, or about whether trans women are in fact women? Isn't that a sort of inappropriate utterance? Well, no, because the point of academic philosophy and academic inquiry more generally is to try to figure out the truth about really important topics. And in those contexts, it is appropriate to ask these sorts of questions and to argue about it, to lay out the best reasons for and against the various cases, and to criticize one another, to subject these arguments to scrutiny. And when you're doing that, you're not unnecessarily bringing harm to someone. In fact, in many cases, the supposed harms or dangers that threaten people are not unnecessary. In order to figure out the answer to these questions, we have to talk about them openly. So we're not unnecessarily endangering anybody. And of course, we're not intentionally endangering anybody. When people argue about these questions, they certainly don't mean harm to anyone. Very often, they're in fact not harming people. Though it is important to distinguish various kinds of harms that you might worry about. So when people say, well, arguing about this stuff is very harmful to people, you definitely want to separate, well, what kind of harm do you have in mind? Do you have in mind something like psychological harm where people are going to be distressed? That's one kind of harm. Another one is you might worry about imminent physical harm. So Rebecca and I heard something like this kind of complaint on Rhodes's campus. Some people were worried that disabled people might be abused as a result of Singer's talk, because it would, contribute to a milieu in which disabled people are less respected. Another kind of harm is you're not worried about it imminently. You're just worried about an environment in which over the long term, people will be abused or harmed or something like that physically. These are all different kinds of harms that you could worry about, and you have to take them sort of case by case and evaluate whether or not these are genuine harms. Because look, if it really is the case that by Peter Singer expressing his views on campus about disability, disabled people really will be imminently like beaten up or harmed or something like that, then of course we would say, then he should be quiet. We shouldn't have the event. And that's because just by preventing him from speaking in this one case, we're not preventing him from ever getting his views out. And we'll, prevent a disabled person from being harmed. We think academic freedom is important, but it's a defeasible right. In some cases, if there's an emergency, you should stop that person from speaking. So when it comes to, like why is academic speech special in some way? It's because the point of what we're doing in academia is trying to figure out the answer to these questions. So we have to ask these sometimes offensive questions. And when it comes to assessing the dangers that are posed, we have to take them case by case and evaluate the severity of the danger.
We defend what we call the institutional model of academic philosophy. So, on our view, academic philosophy is an institution complete with roles and role players, namely philosophers, all of whom are trying to together achieve the institution's legitimate aim, which is philosophical understanding, broadly construed, right? So, epistemic improvement. And everybody in the institution plays their role by, advancing the best, theories, objections, arguments as they see them, and in each, we can see that it's only by referring back to academic philosophy's goal that we can then evaluate and understand why it is that expressing controversial moral and political positions is a completely legitimate and important part of that institution. So in our um, argument, we draw parallels to other institutions where we think people readily recognize that there are some things that you can do only insofar as you're playing your role in a larger institution aimed at a particular goal. So, for instance, um, the adversarial legal system, airport security, markets, acting, comedy, we kind of go through each of these and argue that things that might ordinarily seem completely impermissible actually are permissible when contextualized within the relevant institution. So, if you're considering the adversarial legal system, you could imagine high school students who are attending a trial. They're trying to learn about the criminal justice system. They're watching closely as the prosecutor makes her case. She's presenting evidence, she's presenting arguments, all of which are intended to demonstrate the defendant's guilt, right? And then, here next comes the defense attorney challenging the prosecution's case, trying to explain away much of the prosecution's evidence, offering an alternative narrative that suggests the defendant's innocence. Now things look pretty different. And then, the next day in class, right, if students learn that the defense attorney's role is basically to advocate vigorously for their client, like even if she's unsure that her client is guilty or innocent. And they also learn that most defense attorneys just accept the fact that throughout their career, they will almost certainly, albeit unintentionally, defend several people who are in fact guilty, right? So they accept that they will be again, unintentionally defending, genuine rapists and murderers. And so you can imagine a high school student getting really upset and saying, this is despicable. How is it that this defense attorney can be knowingly defending, rapist and murderer, right? And similarly, the prosecutors knowingly risks prosecuting innocent, law-abiding citizens. So you can imagine the student's outrage, but you need an institutional understanding of the adversarial legal system to appreciate that it's only because this student is focusing narrowly on individual features of the institution without taking it taking without considering its broader purpose, right? So, you know, yes, it's true. It's usually morally wrong to try to convince others that somebody is guilty when you don't know that they are, right? However, trial lawyers operate in a legitimate institution that justifies their morally wrong actions. The adversarial legal system, in other words, has a legitimate goal, which is prosecuting the guilty and exonerating the innocent. And its institutional design is set up to achieve that goal. Now, you might not think any particular institution is legitimate. You might think, oh, to hell with the adversarial legal system, or to hell with airport security. It doesn't matter what institution. Pick your favorite institution. There are all kinds of things that. The permissibility of which only makes sense when you consider the larger institution's purpose or function. So similarly, we argue that when it comes to like the university setting or academic philosophy, it is appropriate and permissible to, forward really controversial positions that lots of people find like morally odious, because all of that contributes to the larger goal of um, improving our understanding and acquiring knowledge, and and that's why it's permissible to, defend abortion, let's say, in academic philosophy, whereas it might not be permissible to defend abortion at the Thanksgiving dinner table because Thanksgiving doesn't require, right, that you talk about abortion.
So some people might claim that we don't need to have these discussions, that we already know what the right answer is, that everybody knows that there should be an unlimited right to abortion, that all people are necessarily equal, that gay marriage should always have been a right, um, and that racial segregation is always wrong, unless, of course, you do it like Harvard, in which case then it's always right. Um, I'm obviously being a bit facetious, but there's a sense in which our moral attitudes have shifted dramatically over time. Um, and part of that has to do with people expressing different views. So in South Africa, for example, it was seen as a really immoral thing for a white person to marry a black person. Gay marriage was seen as either absolutely impossible by definition or deeply immoral. But South Africa was the fifth country in the world to legalize gay marriage because there was vigorous discussion on these things. So it seems to me that part of making moral progress and part of what finding out what is true is entails allowing people who have minority positions to advocate a view. It would have been seen as, deeply offensive to have advocated for interracial marriage or gay marriage at various times in history. But these are now the sort of dominant views, and part of that has to do with the role that academics played. And I suppose the question is this: does that conversation get to keep going, or does the one side get to say, "Well, we've won, and you're akin to a flat earther, and your view can be rejected, and we don't need to entertain it anymore"?
So I'd just like to add to that. So not only does that happen in the moral case where there's some views that are taken as more or less certain, that are the kinds of things you should never overturn. That happens even in, for instance, physics. So Aristotle's physics for over 1,000 years was the standard physics, and it was more or less taken like no one's going to overturn this. There's earth, air, fire, and water, and earth and water go down and fire and air go up, and that's the rough outline of the Aristotelian physics. It was overturned by Newton in the 1600s, and once Newton established the Newtonian mechanics, it was more or less thought that that was it. It was settled that nothing could overturn this. It was so predictively successful that it didn't seem like there was anything else to do. at high level physics. But as a matter of fact, Einstein overturned it in the early 1900s and said, look, it's actually not forces that are working. It's instead curvatures in space-time that explains gravity. That was overturned. For over 1,000 years, Christianity was thought to be the correct view about our place in the cosmos, where we came from, what our moral duties are. But many people thought, over the course of academic inquiry began to think, hey, maybe that's not correct. And they advanced arguments against God's existence. They had biblical criticisms about the historical reliability of the scripture. And now many people regard those as correct. And it's a good thing that people criticize those various views. At the time, they were regarded as deeply harmful and dangerous. Do you know what you're doing by criticizing Christianity or belief in God? Do you know what people are going to do if they don't have some foundation for their morals and they don't understand their place in society? Darwin, do you see that by advancing something like the view you advance in The Origin of Species, that you're undermining people's faith in God and morality? Don't you see? But of course, we all recognize that what Einstein did, what Newton did, what Darwin did was wonderful. And it was great that they advanced arguments against these cherished and widely thought to be settled views. And if that's the case, then it's highly unlikely that within, say, 10 or 15 years, we've just discovered the correct view about gender identity or the correct view about how to think about disability or race or adult child sex or any of these topics. It would be shocking if we should reasonably be more certain that our views about these moral topics is more certain than many of these doctrines that were overturned in physics.
So there's an interesting thing that arises with the Singer case that you've given, which is that you mentioned at the beginning that the talk that he was going to give was about pandemic ethics and not about disability. And so one basis that people have for canceling a speaker is not actually based on the particular speech that they're going to give. It's in relation to who that person is and other views that they've espoused. Now, what you've sort of set up is that if it really were the case that Singer's presence on campus or his speech would lead to imminent violence against the disabled, that would be a good reason to stop the talk. So part of what I wonder about is, how do we determine that to know when there's a genuine threat? And does it matter the source of the violence? So we can imagine two scenarios. The one is that a group of people will be so riled up from Singer being on presence and feel that they are now empowered to go and engage in some violent conduct against the disabled on campus. And the other one is that the disabled on campus will be so upset by Singer's presence that they will act out violently and that they will go and torch the philosophy department, for example. There's an interesting case at the University of Cape Town where for their annual T.B. Davis lecture, Fleming Rose was invited to speak. Now, Fleming Rose was the editor of a newspaper in Denmark called Jürgens Postens, and Jürgens Postens had published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad under conditions when this was viewed as blasphemous and when there were threats against people for doing so. And he took the view that it was important to defy this religious norm because free speech matters, even if it offends people. And so he was seen as a good candidate to speak about free speech because he'd taken a risk. Sometime around that time, people who worked at Charlie Hebdo had been massacred and killed. There were a few cartoonists and journalists who've been killed because of their involvement in depicting Muhammad. And ultimately, the vice chancellor at the time at the University of Cape Town, Max Price, cancelled the academic freedom lecture. And in his book, he describes this as one of the hardest decisions he's ever made, and one that I think he still feels troubled by 10 years later. And part of why he cancelled the talk was on the basis that there were threats of violence from the local Islamic community against the university. So there was a concern that if you allowed the speech to happen, violence would occur. The one counter argument is that this amounts to ceding to the heckler's veto or the assassin's veto, that if any threat of violence against your talk you sort of see as being a possibility, regardless of the evidence in it, you cancel it, well, then you open up the floodgates for many things to be canceled because of threats. So I wonder if you differentiate between where the violence emanates from. One could phrase it broadly like, will a harm result, or does it matter where the source of the harm is?
So I would say, first, we must always be clear that the university runs on ideas, right? Not intimidation. So the university is an institution committed to inquiry. That's the mission. And that means that even when somebody is advancing a view that others regard as morally reprehensible or odious, the appropriate reaction is not to silence them, but to engage them, to challenge them, to bring your reasons, arguments, and evidence to the table. Right? We don't do censorship here. Is essentially the larger message. So show up to the talk. Of course, you can also protest peacefully as long as you're not disrupting the event. And I would say, if you're so convinced that the speaker is deeply mistaken, then why is it that you are afraid to show up and raise your objections or your arguments, right? There's a certain kind of insecurity that is betrayed when people resort to trying to shut down a talk rather than engaging a speaker as they ought to on a campus with ideas, objections, evidence, arguments, and all of that. So that's the first thing. We have to send a clear message that this is a university and we trade in arguments, evidence, and reasons. Again, of course, if there's a real threat, credible threat of violence, I would say no matter where it's coming from, right, it doesn't matter if it's like the speaker's supporters or the speaker's dissenters. University leadership needs to step in and ensure that, again, everybody's physical safety is looked after. And that might mean postponing the talk, and this is really crucial, it's postponing the talk, not canceling the talk. So I think it's really, really important that universities don't send the message that these kinds of efforts to censor or silence permissible speech on campus are going to work, right? That hosting these kinds of talks is completely appropriate at the university. And so we are going to postpone the event to a later date where we have ample security in place, where we can ensure that the talk can go forward, and where we uphold the mission of the university, which requires, again, a space in which people can actually float and explore and argue for controversial moral and political positions.
Two questions here. One is, look, when there are these claims about threats of harms that will result, you let this person give this talk. One question is like, well, what's the evidence for these claims and how do you assess them? And the other is like, well, what do you do when various people are threatening harm? So let's start with the evidence claims. So you want to assess one, what is the harm that we're worried about? Again, so one concern is, well, if he gives this talk, there will be imminent physical harm to disabled people on campus. But then, of course, the question is, well, who's likely to cause the harm? And like, where would it come from? And is there a way to stop it? If there's very often there's no identifiable person who's going to commit the harm. So that was, nobody said in the Rhodes case who's going to harm what disabled person. Very often these are just undersupported claims, and the function of the claims is just to get the talk stopped, because most people recognize that if there really is going to be physical harm to people, then that's a good reason to stop the talk. Very often they're just deeply undersupported claims. So Rhodes campus is among the safest places on planet Earth for disabled people. It's a college campus with tons of open-minded people, a lot of college kids who would be, their academic life would be ruined if they physically assaulted disabled people, and they have no desire to do that anyways. So college campus, so it's just, you take the claims one by one and assess them for their plausibility. It just isn't at all plausible that anybody's going to go around harming disabled people on campus. If you just think about the history of Peter Singer talks, Peter Singer has given hundreds, probably thousands of talks on campuses. Go look and see, have disabled people been abused shortly after a Peter Singer talk? I guarantee you that the answer is almost certainly no. But I think, so that's to say, if you're worried about imminent physical harm, you should go assess the claims on the basis of the evidence. And it doesn't look like the evidence is very good. If you're worried about imminent psychological harm, so you might worry, well, no, we're not worried that they're going to get hurt physically. We're worried that they'll be distressed in various ways. Question is, what kind of distress, and is that relevant, and would that justify silencing people? If it's just, well, they'll be offended or they'll be upset that this view is being expressed, well, that happens all the time on college campuses. There are people who argue against a belief in God. They argue that belief in God is irrational, that there is no God. That's very distressing to a lot of people who are theists. No one thinks for a second that that psychological distress justifies silencing a speaker arguing for atheism. People argue against abortion. They argue for abortion. That's very distressing to a lot of people who hold different views about these things. They argue different views about immigration restrictions. Some people argue that there should be immigration restrictions and people from a certain country should be stopped from immigrating. That's very distressing to people from that country who are there in the audience, but no one thinks for a second that that justifies stopping them. So for those, it may be that the evidence is excellent that that sort of harm will occur, but it's just not the kind of harm that would justify silencing a speaker. Otherwise, we should silence speakers constantly because that sort of psychological harm is constantly being experienced by students. Then, of course, there's a worry that, well, if they're here, we're not worried about imminent harm of any kind. It's just we're worried about long-term, giving license to a kind of milieu in which people abuse people. And the question is, what's the evidence that that is in fact going to happen? Very often it's not especially good. How would this one utterance or this one talk from Peter Singer make a significant difference in the attitudes of people around the world or around the country or around this campus or something? You could just as easily imagine that by trying to figure out these questions, we realize, oh, Peter Singer's wrong, and we realize why he's wrong, and it actually makes it even safer for disabled people. It's not clear how this talk is going to contribute to harm rather than benefit for disabled people if we're just worried about the long-term future. No one has a crystal ball. No one can see that far in the future. So we almost certainly shouldn't be like stopping people from expressing their views when we have such meager evidence about what the long-term consequences are going to be.
So it's also worth noting that these debates about harm pretty much always involve two sides deeply disagreeing about both, one, who is being harmed, and two, what the harm consists in. Take the debates between trans-inclusive feminist philosophers and gender-critical feminist philosophers, in their arguing over what it means to be a woman and how womanhood should be socially and politically defined. If you ask the trans inclusive side, Talia May Betcher, for instance, who's a prominent voice on that side, she's going to argue that the harms at stake are harms to trans people, and that we need to protect trans people from the harms that gender critical views incur. And analogously, on the other side, gender critical feminists such as Kathleen Stock argue that no, the real harm is a harm to adult human females or to biological females. It doesn't include trans women, and that it's the trans inclusive side that is actually incurring harm. So they are disagreeing about the very nature of the harm itself. And that's not just true of the trans case. This is really important too. This is a general phenomenon about any high stakes moral and political topic you're talking about, right? So this is true of debates about disability and abortion, euthanasia, vaccine mandates, immigration, reparations, genetic engineering, et cetera, right? People are pretty much always disagreeing about the harms and who is at risk of being harmed. And so, again, you can't get around the fact that, the way that we need to sort this out is figure out, which substantive view is correct, and that requires, an environment in which we can discuss the ideas and see, what the force of each argument is. It requires essentially an academic environment that allows for and even encourages viewpoint diversity.
So it seems to me that there's further value in having a controversial speaker come onto a campus, which is that their views might have been mischaracterized. So the view about Singer was that he holds some kind of negative view about the disabled and that his mere presence would be contrary to their interests. But actually, there's a sense in which the view was mischaracterized. So if we sort of look at the content of what he'd written, he'd said there was a practice in Australia in the 70s that when children were born with spina bifida, which at the time was very painful and incurable, that the practice was that all support would be withdrawn from the child. They wouldn't be fed and they wouldn't be presented with water until they would die about a week later. And he said, this seems like an incredibly cruel practice. And if the view is that that is the most merciful thing to do for the child, well, it seems that active euthanasia, taking a step like giving the child morphine, would be even more merciful because you would reduce the suffering. So that sort of sophisticated argument then gets misconstrued into this idea that, Peter Singer is some kind of eugenicist who wants to eradicate the disabled, when in fact, he's um, a descendant of Holocaust survivors, very much cares about the vulnerable, very much takes equality quite seriously. And the advantage of having someone like that come onto campus is that someone who misunderstands the view gets the opportunity to ask questions and find out, do you actually believe what I've been told you believe? And then have the argument. What's interesting, of course, about the Rhodes case is that Singer would have presented his talk over Zoom, which he ultimately did, and wouldn't have even been on campus. So there's sort of levels of vitriol of like something bad on the internet is happening right now was sort of ludicrous.
I just want to comment that, so far we've been assuming that the people who are objecting to the speaker more or less have their views right, but it's important that, and we were interested in that for the theoretical sort of like ethical implications of that. But you're right that in the real world, very often these sorts of objections to speakers are on the basis of deep misunderstandings about the speaker's view. That's what was so frustrating about this Singer incident, is that many of these people were hearing about Peter Singer for the first time. They were hearing about his views for the first time ever. And nevertheless, they had very confident views about Peter Singer being an ableist. But of course, they were just wrong about what Peter Singer was arguing. And what I found deeply distressing about this whole situation is that it was very difficult to correct these sorts of misunderstandings, because it requires that you explain at length what his actual view was and what motivates that view. And most people don't want to hear that. What they want to do is be mad. They want to be upset about the speaker. They want to get excited. They want to, present themselves as an advocate for the oppressed. And they're just not going to sit around for very long to try to figure out these ideas. And you can see that again, because many of these people had never read Peter Singer in their life. In fact, one person who wrote me, a faculty member at Rhodes, called him Peter Springer. He didn't even know the guy's name. And nevertheless, he knew that he was a terrible ableist and doesn't belong on campus. Another indication is just that the views that the Rhodes faculty had of Peter Singer and his views were mistaken. Is just that he's a philosopher at Princeton University. And so if he was just like this virulent ableist, you would expect the people at Princeton to sort of know that about this professor. And I guess I found it a little bit surprising that people on Rhodes' campus thought themselves to be better judges about who belongs on campus and who doesn't than Princeton University. But nevertheless, it very often happens that people still, they don't consider for a second that maybe they're missing something. Maybe this guy who Princeton seems to think is worthy to be on campus is in fact worthy to be on campus, and I just don't have the right understanding of his views. It's very difficult to convince people of that in the moment.
So, Rebecca, I'd like to talk more about that idea of speech on campus. So we can think about academic freedom in a narrow sense, that it only refers to academics and refers to public talks or academic papers. But we can also broaden the topic to think about the kinds of speech that we ought to tolerate on a campus. And what we've seen a lot of recently around the world are campus protests, where students and staff will express strong views on political matters. And so I wonder if you think that this form of speech should be totally unfettered, or whether there should be time, place, and manner restrictions. So, for example, one might think that you are free to express your political view. You can hold up a poster, but in the math class, you can't suddenly hijack the environment and express your view in that space, because the other students are paying to be there and to learn about maths. So do you think that we should have any restrictions on the speech, or should it be a free-for-all?
Yes, there should absolutely be reasonable limits on speech because, again, the university has a function, teaching and research, and we need to protect the mission of the university. And anything that threatens to disrupt the mission of the university should be stopped or disallowed. And, universities have time, place, and manner restrictions for precisely this reason. So, of course, you can peacefully protest on campus, but there are also areas and times, when you can't protest. So, for instance, you can't protest so loudly that, the chemistry students can't hear their professor, right? Again, you're making it impossible for students to actually learn, and that's one of the chief purposes of the university. That would be disallowed. Similarly, you can't protest in residential dorms where students are sleeping. Limits are necessary to ensure that protests don't interfere, again, with the core function of the university. I do want to emphasize, though, that protest itself is a vital form of expression. It's had a very long and important history on university campuses. So none of this is to say that universities shouldn't permit peaceful protests. Universities, after all, are places that have lots of legitimate purposes. So some people think, look, it's not only the place where knowledge is transmitted. The university is also the place where people are trying to figure out what justice demands, right? And protest has played a crucial part in that process. So again, the idea is we should allow for protest and speech, again, so long as it doesn't undermine the mission of the university, the central mission of the university, which is, again, education, research, pursuit of inquiry.
It's often said that protests are supposed to be disruptive. So it's okay for us to, disrupt these classes because that's the point. We're trying to correct for an injustice here. And of course, that's true in one sense of disruptive. It's protests are supposed to be disruptive just in the sense that it calls attention to itself and it, publicizes a message that you otherwise wouldn't hear. But of course, you can do that in open spaces on a university campus. Just because it should be disruptive in some sense or other doesn't mean it can be endlessly disruptive. If you're protesting something that's happening on campus. You can't go to the campus hospital and protest in the middle of a surgery and disrupt the surgery. But it's supposed to be disruptive. Well, pretty obviously, it's not supposed to disrupt the legitimate aims of some institution or some group of people doing this thing that's obviously legitimate. And of course, when teachers are teaching their classes, they're obviously engaged in an institution that is forwarding some legitimate aim, namely educating the students. And so you can't disrupt that activity, though you can be disruptive in the sense that, people who are walking along are going to hear what you're saying and see what you're doing. That's a kind of disruption that's perfectly fine, but not endlessly disruptive. And that's why I think, of course, time, manner, and place restrictions should be there. But once students are complying with the time, manner, and speech restrictions, then it seems to me that, they should be able to say more or less whatever they want. Absent real threats or incitements to violence and the standard restrictions along those lines.
So I've got two cases I'd like you guys to think about. The one is that you've got a group of students who are unable to pay their university fees. And maybe part of this is because they've grown up in a society with structural injustice. And so they are impoverished, for reasons that are beyond their control. And they want to engage in protest action to shut down the campus so that for a period of a week or so, other students will be unable to go to lectures and experience what it's like to be locked out of campus opportunities. And they might say this particular form of protest is important to demonstrate our view, that merely saying, free education is important would be insufficient. So that's case one. And case two would be students who really care about a global conflict. So you can imagine that those who have strong views on the war between Russia and Ukraine want to express a strong view about it. And let's assume that you have a lot of Russian students on campus who want to express the view that the Ukrainians are Nazis, that the Azov Brigade, who were clearly waving around swastikas, demonstrate that all Ukrainians are Nazis, and that they should be eradicated, and that Russia is engaged in a just war, and that the Ukrainians on campus need to know that they are part of an evil society and that they should be marginalized. And actually what the students want to do as well would be to call for boycott action, to say that the university should have no dealings with Ukrainians, that Ukrainians are sinister, that they're a fake nation who have no real rights to be there, and want to advocate for that sort of like boycott action. do you have views on these two cases?
Yeah, so my inclination about the person who wants to stop campus activities because they were poor and were locked out is that, look, this person has a legitimate complaint, but the legitimate complaint isn't against the university and it's not against the students who are there who are going to be disruptive. So they're not the proper target of one's disruptive activity. The complaint that they have is presumably against the state that they're in, or the government that they're a part of, or the police, or some other sort of institution that has unjustly impoverish them. If that's the case, then those are the proper targets of one's disruptive activity, if that's the ineffective way of doing it. But one, first of all, it's just going to be totally ineffective. That's just not going to be the way that things are changed for that person. But even if they are, still, these people are not the proper targets of your disruption, because they're not responsible for the injustice that you've suffered. So you should, just as in war, you should direct your defensive activity at the people who actually pose a threat to you. You should also direct your disruptive activity towards the people who are, in fact, causing the injustice for you. And then when it comes to the Ukrainians and calling them Nazis and marginalizing them on campus, I guess similar things apply to them. It may be the case that the Ukrainian government is evil or something like that, but of course, the students on campus are not identical to the Ukrainian government. So again, they're not going to be proper targets of your aggression or whatever sort of marginalization you want to direct their way. So again, they're just not going to be proper targets. Again, and also it just strikes me as just totally ineffective too. So it seems like if you're going to marginalize people or harm them in various ways, it should at least be reasonable that this will be effective in some way. So I think it fails on both grounds. I mean, I don't think merely being effective would be sufficient for marginalizing these people, but at least it's a necessary condition. And I think both of those are not present in this case. Both measures are not going to be effective, and they're both, the aggression is sort of aimed at improper targets, that is, people who are not responsible for the injustice that's being suffered.
While peaceful protest should be permitted, it's crucial that the university also prohibits genuine harassment, genuine bullying, right? Anything that makes it difficult for a student to safely walk to class, right? To show up and learn because, they're being harassed by fellow students or professors or somebody else at the university, is completely impermissible and needs to be struck down and handled immediately.
So, Eric, I'd like to ask you about this, that there is injustice in the world, and you've both said that one of the purposes of the university is to educate people about eradicating injustices. Should universities take an institutional stance on global injustice? Should a university say, we support the Uyghurs in China, or we think that what the government of Myanmar is doing to the Rohingya is unconscionable, and we will not allow any academic from Myanmar to engage in a research collaboration with our university because we stand against injustice? Or does that stray beyond the role of university? Should they be non-partisan in global conflicts?
It strikes me as a mistake for universities to take a stand on these issues for the following reason. It seems like universities themselves aren't especially well placed to make judgments about these things. It's also just not their job. So if you think about what are administrators supposed to be doing, it seems like what they're supposed to be doing is something like securing the funding, organizing the classes, getting the professors organized and hired, and those sorts of things. And then, but it seems perfectly permissible for individual professors or individual members of the campus community to take stands on these things and to argue for those things. But you just ask yourself, what is the point of the campus administration, the president, and so on? It's to ensure the proper functioning of the university, and what the proper functioning of the university is to be an institution that seeks the truth about various matters: physical matters, biological matters, philosophical matters, and so on. And it seems that university administrators aren't especially well placed to make calls about these things, but perhaps their faculty are, and it's perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned for individual faculty members to take a very strong stance about these matters. But the university just, they should more or less stick to their job, because that's what they're especially well placed to do. It seems to me that administrators aren't in a particularly good spot to make judgments about these things, but faculty are.
So Harvard has been in the news lately, and has been put under pressure by the Trump administration. And one of the things that has been demanded by the Trump administration is that Harvard enforce viewpoint diversity. And there's a concern that only some views are palatable at Harvard, and that this creates an environment that is antithetical to academic freedom. So there's two aspects to the question. One is, can you explain what viewpoint diversity would entail in academic context and whether it's worth striving for? And then secondly, whether it's desirable for the state to enforce it. And this again could come in two different flavors. The one would be a refusal to invest in the university by withholding investment funding, or two, punishing a university for its failure by instituting a fine or some other kind of sanction.
Viewpoint diversity is absolutely vital at the university. Again, what is the university for? It's an institution devoted to inquiry. We're trying to understand the subject matter of different disciplines, whether that's biology or philosophy or history or anything else. Why is viewpoint diversity valuable in that context? It's because having a diversity of perspectives and views helps advance our understanding. Right? People with different perspectives, different takes, are far better positioned than those who are like-minded to spot the weaknesses in competing views, right? The holes, uh, the evidence that has not been taken into consideration, right? That kind of pressure forces us to sharpen and improve our arguments, right? That's really crucial. I do want to add that when we say viewpoint diversity, we're not just saying every single view imaginable, needs to be um, represented on university campus, right? So, we're not saying, oh, okay, the physics department must hire an Aristotelian physicist, right? Who believes that, the Earth is at the center of the universe and there are four fundamental elements, right? I mean, plausible views are what's important for viewpoint diversity. So, how is it that we determine what counts as a plausible view? That's where we defer to domain experts, right? Of course, domain experts aren't going to be flawless in determining, what is and is not a plausible view, but they're basically the best that we've got, and can generally trust the physicist to say, yeah, we don't really need to hire the Aristotelian physicist. That's not a serious contender. Um, uh, and when it comes to these high stakes moral and political debates, obviously there's rampant disagreement. It's not obvious exactly what to think, and so it is especially important in areas in the humanities and social sciences that we have viewpoint diversity represented.
I mean, I'm inclined to say, yeah, a viewpoint diversity is definitely valuable. It's one value among many, so it's not the only value. So it should be weighed against other things, but for sure, it's valuable. And why is that? Well, what is the purpose of a university? Again, at least one of the purposes is to discover the truth about really important matters. So one thing that's going to be helpful for that is people who have different views, who are able to spot the shortcomings in prevailing views or in other views, so are able to lob criticisms against various views, which in turn encourages the defenders of those views to mount responses. And then you get this back and forth that we're all familiar with in academic contexts, in which we gain an understanding as a result of the back and forth between people who have different views. So I think viewpoint diversity is certainly valuable for that reason. Again, the purposes of finding the truth. And as Rebecca mentioned, it's obviously useful for the purposes of teaching as well, because people who have a diversity of views better understand a range of views, and the students are more likely to get those and to begin and to gain an understanding as they're being taught by those kinds of professors. Now, the question is, should the government enforce it? Well, if you had a reason to think that your state-funded universities are not systematically discriminating against a certain kind of view, or people with a certain kind of view, then I think that should be troubling to the university. If the point of their funding it is to figure out the truth, and the universities are biased in various ways that are biasing them against the truth, then I think the state has an interest in that. So now, what should the proper response be? Well, you might think, well, they should go in and fire people, or they should go in and impose their own views about viewpoint diversity. I'm inclined to think that's not a good idea, mostly because what constitutes diversity and what constitutes a healthy range of diversity is going to be very discipline dependent, and government administrators typically do not have that kind of knowledge. And so you're inevitably going to need to lean on the professional judgment of people in academia to do these things. However, I do think it's not unreasonable if the university, if it's very clear that there's a lack of diversity among faculty. I think it's perfectly permissible for governments to withhold funds to say, listen, until you guys get your act together, we're not going to forcibly take tax dollars from our citizens and then hand them to you, who's just going to go forward your political views at taxpayer expense. I think it's totally legitimate for the government to say, that's not one of the things that we're going to do. So if you had reason to think that perhaps one discipline or one part of the university was deeply biased in some way, I think it's totally permissible for the state to say, listen, it would be unjust for us to forcibly take tax dollars from people and then give them to you, who's just going to forward your own idiosyncratic views at the expense of broader views. We're not going to be engaged in that project.
So there's a popular conception of academic freedom, which is that there is an obligation on donors and the state who supply universities with money to continue to do so, and that withdrawing their funds infringes on academic freedom. Is there support for this argument, or do you think that donors should be free to say, I don't like that you teach this kind of course, that you've employed this kind of person, or that you've taken this political stance, and on that basis, I'm no longer comfortable with donating money to you? Is that donor in withdrawing their funds infringing on the university's academic freedom? And similarly, if a foreign government supplies money to a university and says, well, we don't supply money to people who do research with Iran or China or Russia, we're going to pull our funds, are they interfering with academic freedom?
Yeah, I certainly don't see how private individual donors have any moral obligation whatsoever to continue donating money to a particular university or a particular university department or program, right? Obviously, private donors can do whatever they want with their money. And analogously, you might think that if a private donor was donating to a charity, and then that charity started to have a seemingly different mission from the mission that the donor understood the charity to be for in the first place, then that donor can decide to no longer contribute to that charity, right? There can be all kinds of reasons, or it could be, hey, I'm interested in other issues now. I can't imagine any argument in defense of a private donor's continued obligation to donate to a university.
Yeah, academic freedom is typically thought to be a right against interference with respect to your academic endeavors. So if these private donors were taking their money and they were using it to interfere with people's inquiry, if they were paying money to bribe journals to retract their articles, or they were I don't know, using it to in other ways like restrict their speech, that would be a kind of violation of academic freedom. But it's not a violation of academic freedom not to fund these things. That would just be a failure to support or something like that, but it wouldn't be something like restricting your freedom. So yeah, I think certainly private donors don't have an obligation to fund whatever, inquiry you regard as really valuable. Again, you might complain about that, but it wouldn't be reasonable to complain that's a violation of your academic freedom. At best, it would be a complaint that you're not funding things that would be nice to fund.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of complaint, but it's not an academic freedom complaint.
So I've mentioned the idea of academic boycotts in our discussion, and so I want to try and deal with that question. So imagine the university took a very strong view on the war between Russia and Ukraine and prohibited any of its academics from engaging in research collaborations with Ukrainians. That anybody who was dealing with the Ukrainian academic would have to stop their research in the name of not participating in a global injustice. You could imagine, of course, that another university takes the view about the Russians. Would that be an infringement on the academic freedom of those who work at the university, where they are told that the kind of research you're allowed to engage in is restricted, or the kinds of people that you're allowed to collaborate with is restricted?
that would be a pretty straightforward violation of an individual researcher's academic freedom. Part of academic freedom is getting to determine, who you're going to collaborate with and what research project you're going to pursue. So, yes, I think it qualifies as a violation of academic freedom, uncontroversially. It might not be an uncontroversial violation. Uh, I would also add that relatedly, I think it's a very good thing that, you know, many universities, over 100 universities in the States, I believe, have adopted the Chicago principles or the Calvin principles, which are principles of institutional neutrality. They say it's not the business of the university to be taking a stand on contested questions. Rather, it's really important that the university is a place that protects academic freedom.
In that case, it's not merely a failure to support, it's an interference. It's actively preventing people from collaborating when they would otherwise collaborate. So it's going out of your way to stop something that they would do on their own accord. And in that case, it does seem to me a restriction of academic freedom, again, because academic freedom is taken to be a negative right, a right against unjust interference or unjustified interference. It also strikes me as just an unprincipled kind of restriction on academic freedom, because if the concern is, well, the researchers are from a country that's committing a grave injustice, well, I got news for you. I mean, most countries are committing grave injustices of various kinds, and we know that. So, if you were to extend that principle in a principled way, then you'd have to restrict tons of people from collaborating with one another because lots of governments are committing injustice. But most people who restrict for these reasons, these supposed reasons at least, pick conflicts or injustices that they're very concerned with, and they don't seem to worry about other sorts of injustices. In other words, they restrict in unprincipled ways. As always, there are proper targets and improper targets of one's restrictive measures, and in this case, it seems clear that the researcher isn't responsible for the injustices that you object to in the Ukraine-Russia war, so they're not a proper target of your interference.
There's been a growing concern that universities have become places of indoctrination as opposed to places where people can thrive and be exposed to a variety of ideas and become independent thinkers. What are the reforms that you think universities should be engaged in to ensure that they are still seen as bastions of genuine education?
So this is tough. I share the concern that universities have become these sort of very ideologically narrow institutions that discriminate against people on the basis of their views on a fairly regular basis. The reason it's difficult to know what sort of reforms to implement is because these reforms would need to be carried out by the very people who have made the institution the kind of narrow place that it is. And so what you would be asking them to do is to sort of act against their inclinations that they already are sort of deeply ingrained in them. And so I would love to say, well, here's just like a 4 or 5 step plan in order to do this. But though I haven't given a ton of thought to this, maybe there are measures that you could implement. But my concern is just that whatever measures you give people, they're going to need to be implemented by the very people who have already made the institution what it is. And so I think we should at least be open to this suggestion. I'm not saying this is the case that we have, but we should be open to the suggestion that some institutions are beyond repair, that you can't fix the problems that they have. The best you could do is something like basically completely eliminate them and come up with something entirely new. I'm not saying that's the case with American academia, but I do think that is at least a possibility for some institutions. They could be so far gone that there's no way to reform them, at least from the inside.
And how do we get out of this mess, by the way? I mean, how did we get into a situation where on campuses it became appropriate to kind of narrow the bounds of intellectual life, where certain views can no longer be voiced, certain questions can no longer be asked, and essentially where you have a lot of people in academic spaces and communities who are self-policing, right? Often they are more afraid of the judgment of their peers or the kind of social tyranny that can come from people who find it deeply offensive or abhorrent to hold certain views or even ask certain questions. So I would say that's a problem no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. I think people across the political spectrum have felt this in the university for some time, and it's something that's increasingly discussed. I would say that part of reform needs to involve individual members of these institutions, specifically people who are tenured, um, speaking up and using their voice and courage to try to reclaim principles of academic freedom on campuses. Right? So there are many, many people who do not support threats to academic freedom or the kind of culture where people feel afraid to explore different ideas. And, in order for us to actually change the climate at universities, the people who are most secure there need to stop just keeping their heads down and frankly speak up and try to exercise control, right? So tenure, we think of tenure maybe as the thing that enables you to do your research and continue to have a paycheck, but tenure is also vitally there so that you can speak up and share a view that might not be popular with your administration or with other faculty or students and be protected. So, you know, I think people really need to stop laying low, start showing up, and that should fall primarily to those of us with tenure.
I should also say, for all my doom and gloom, the university is doing pretty well compared to other institutions that human beings have formed when it comes to trying to figure out the answer to really important questions. So, though the university certainly has its flaws, and I have tons of criticisms compared to any other sort of institution that's doing this kind of thing. Seems like universities are doing pretty well. So we should be thankful for the good that universities do, in addition to any sort of criticisms that we want to lob their way.
Well, guys, it was absolutely fabulous and truly a delight having you guys on the show. Always wonderful to have both of you as guests. I have to say, doing this without Jason has been challenging, but really wonderful. And for those of you watching on YouTube, we look forward to hearing your thoughts on the nature of universities and where you think the limits are of academic freedom.